probably 20 to 30 minutes on our left side.
Now folks, here in Key West, you're in the southernmost city in the continental United States, and it is the oldest city in southern Florida. Now this oldest city in Florida itself is St. Augustine, but that's 470 miles from here. In order to get there from here, you'd have to take a plane or a boat or travel over 42 bridges just to get back to the mainland. Now folks, Key West is twice the size today as it was back in the 1800s. During our tour today, I'll show you how all that came about. Now we'll be going down some narrow streets and it might be a little bumpy, so I ask y'all please remain seated at all times. And keep your arms and legs and hands and feet inside the train at all times. And the little ropes on the side are just there as a reminder to do so, because we don't want anybody losing a toe. Now folks, this is public transportation, so there's no smoking allowed and no alcohol aboard the train. The first part of our tour will be about 50 minutes. We'll be going past over 100 different points of interest in our whole tour. But the first part we'll be going around the island and we'll be passing some of these points of interest. Now I'm not allowed by law to be able to stop and take pictures, but I can't slow down as much as the traffic will allow because I know you're on vacation and you want to be taking pictures. Then after about 45 to 50 minutes we'll be stopping at our first stop, where there's restrooms and a little gift shop. And there's a little snack bar inside. You can bring anything back on the train to eat or drink as long as it's non-alcoholic. Now folks, this is a fully narrated tour, so I ask everybody to please quiet your cell phones. And if you do talk to one another, do so in a very low voice so it doesn't interfere with other folks that are trying to listen to the tour. And the folks that are sitting backwards, if I say something's off to the right, you just look to the left and vice versa. Now folks, I'm going to do a little paperwork, and I'm going to get a head count, and then we're going to be off to see Old Town Key West. And I want to thank everybody for coming to Key West, and thank you for riding on the world-famous Conch Train Tour. And folks, please hold on to all your belongings, because I'm not allowed by law to stop out on the street if something falls off the train. So please hold on, because like I said earlier, the streets might be a little bumpy. So just please hold on, and it is getting a little windy, so watch your hats. And I'm going to do a little head count now and paperwork. We'll be off to see Old Town Key West. Folks, we're going to go off to see Old Town Key West. We just got y'all aboard. Off to the right, there's a little yellow ticket booth. And our depot was a one-man barber shop here in Key West for some 39 years. And the next building on the corner, the Art Center Gallery, this started out as the very first home of the American Red Cross here back during World War II. And now, folks, down this little street to the right is our very first tourist attraction that was built here back in 1934 by the WBA. Now, this building on the corner was built in 1852 as a building number 1 by the Navy. It's today a 2-story air-conditioned mall here in downtown Key West. And the red building over to the right, that was built here back in 1890 as our federal courthouse and customs house. Now, it was built to the same specifications as all other federal buildings back then. That's why it's got the peaked roofs, so the snow doesn't build up on it. And here to the right is our Mel Fisher Maritime Museum. Mel Fisher and his men, back in 1985, found the wreckage of a Spanish galleon ship, the Atocha. It sank out in the coral reef about 32 miles west of here, back in 1622. Now this ship was loaded with gold, silver, and emeralds. And many of those artifacts can be found inside the museum today. Now just ahead of us on the right, we're going to pass 2 white pillars. Between these 2 white pillars is what's called the Presidential Gates. Now these presidential gates were built in 1906, and they were to be opened only for seated presidents or foreign dignitaries. On beyond those 2 gates is the Truman White House. President Truman, when he was in office, spent 11 working holidays here in Key West. That's right at 180 days. coming up on our left, folks, we're going to pass a large tree. This tree is a banyan tree. It's a member of the Pica family of trees. Now all these areas, the roots you see hanging down, they look like ropes. Every time one of those touches the ground, it'll form another trunk of the tree. So that tree grows horizontally as well as vertically. And coming up on our right, we're going to pass our Key West Post Office. This post office was designed and built by our former mayor and architect, Sonny McCoy. And it's built to look like the 3 Civil War forts that we have here on the island. Now folks, as we're passing the library, notice out in the yard there'll be some chickens and roosters. There might even be some little baby chicks. Those we call chicken nuggets. But those chickens and roosters, they were brought here back in the 1800s by the Cuban cigar rollers as entertainment. They would roll cigars all day, then they would watch cockfights at night. Well, when cockfighting was outlawed, they had nothing else to do with those birds but to let them go free. So they did, and now they're here protected in Key West because we're in a bird sanctuary. Now coming up, I'm going to turn left here on Fleming Street. As I'm turning to the left, you'll notice mile marker 0 to the right. This is the very start of Highway US 1, the East Coast Highway that goes from here in Key West up to Fort Kent, Maine, up on the Canadian border. That's some 2,209 miles to the north. Many of the local folks call it the highway that goes from the palms to the pines.
Like early, like Star is, right?
Now here on Fleming Street off to the right, we're going to pass the Morel Guest Mansion. It's the second building in. It's got purple shutters. This was the home of Francisco Morel. He was a Cuban. He was in a Cuban prison. He bribed his way out. He came here to Key West, built a large factory for rolling cigars over here in the parking lot where the hotel has a parking lot today. Well, he was very successful, so he built that home for his Key West wife and her 8 children. Now, they hadn't been in the home but about 3 years, and he passed away unexpectedly. Well, the Key West wife thought she had it made, and I guess she did, until there was a knock on the door. Here appears another wife, this one from Havana. She had paperwork saying she'd been married to Francisco. Well, she took it to court, and sure enough, she ended up with all the property and all the holdings. So she immediately put the Key West wife and her 8 children out on the streets, homeless and penniless. Now, they say that home is still haunted to this day because the ghost of the Key West wife roams up and down the halls all hours of the day and night, moaning and crying over what she lost. Now, folks, here in Key West, you're in a historic preservation area. Now, it's one of the largest ones in the country. And in this preservation area, there are over 3,000 buildings. Of those 3,000 buildings, over 10% of them are on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, it's also the largest number of wooden structures in any one given area in all of southern Florida. Now, folks, coming up on our right, we're going to pass the Marquise's Cafe. If you look just to the left of those 2 front doors, you'll see a little bronze plaque. Well, that bronze plaque is the indication that that building's on the National Register of Historic Places. And here on the right is what many of the homes look like here in Key West. This is a New England classical design, like a house built on top of a house. 2 porches, and doors are above doors, and windows above windows. This is another variation of it here with the purple shutters. But off to the left is another style of home. It's the Conch style or Bahamian style home. Notice it has much higher ceilings. And it has a wraparound porch, which is great for circulation of air around the house. And here to the right, this pink building is our Key West Library. Now, this library was founded back in 1892. One of the oldest libraries in all of southern Florida. And in the backyard of the library is a beautiful palm garden with over 25 different varieties of palms from the Florida Keys and from the Bahamas. Coming up, we're going to pass another house on our left behind 2 other palm trees. As we get up to the house, look down the roof line. You'll notice a zig and a zag and a zig and a zag in that roof line. That's called a zigzag house. Now, those zigs and zags were added as the family would grow. Now, the high ceilings were great for dissipating heat within the home. And those valleys were used to collect rainwater, which would be stored in cisterns in the backyard. Here on our left coming up is a yellow building with the green shutters was our sponge warehouse. Sponging here in Key West was a very lucrative business. Back in 1800s, the Key West spongers found the sponge beds out on the coral reef. So they'd go out there with their boat. It was very shallow water, so they'd look over the side with a glass bottom bucket, find the sponge they wanted, pluck it off with a 3-prong rake, load it into their boat. Later in the day, they'd come ashore. They'd wash these sponges, process them, they'd go out to market. They were marketed all over the nation. Well, they were making up to $1 million a year selling these sponges up until 1819, or 1918. That's when a red algae struck out on the Atlantic coast and killed many of the sponge beds. Some of them did make it back, but in the meantime, they invented the synthetic sponge. Well, today, if you want to find a real sponge, down in Mallory Square, where we'll conclude our tour later on, there will be a little sponge market that has real sponges that come from the coral reef. Now, folks, coming up on the next corner will be another Conch style or Bahamian style home. It's got the number 1029 on the fence. It's just been restored, but that was the home of Thomas Thompson. Thomas Thompson made his money here in Key West making cigar boxes. But he had a very industrious son named Norbert. Norbert was responsible for building many of the schooner ships here on the island. This company called Thompson Industries. Later today, I'll pass one of those. I'll show you the last one that was built here on the island. Now, folks, here in Key West, the U.S. military has always had a very strong presence. This property directly across the street, where I'm going to be turning right, back in the 1830s was the marching grounds and the bivouac area for the U.S. Army. Well, they turned it over to the Navy, and the Navy built a housing area out of it and named it Perry Court, after Commodore Perry, one of the first men to make it to the North Pole. Well, today it's home for many of our Coast Guard families here on the island. Folks, at this time in our tour, if there are any military veterans on the train, we'd like to thank them for their time and service, making this a much better place for us to live in the great old USA. And here to the right is our Key West Armory, built back in 1800 by the federal government. Coming up on our left, we're going to pass a white picket fence. Beyond this white picket fence is military cemetery. It was decommissioned back in 1921, and all the bodies were taken and buried up in Pensacola. But when they were doing some dirt work, they found some bones, so they recommissioned it, put that one marker in the center of the property. Now, nothing can be built in that sacred ground, because it's back being a military cemetery. And here to the left, notice many of these homes in Old Town Key West. They're small and compact. They're built very close together. Well, these were built by the ship's carpenters. The ship's carpenters would build these homes just the way they built the ships, without the use of nails. Rather than use nails to put these homes together, they would use a mortise and tenon joint. And that mortise and tenon joint allowed enough flexibility so that when the ships were out at sea, they would actually move and sway with the wave action. Well, many of these homes are well over 100 years old here in Key West, been through many hurricanes. When those strong winds of the hurricanes come, these homes actually move and sway along with the winds that blow in the hurricanes. Now we're driving down a little narrow street called the Meadows. This is a residential area. As we're driving through, notice all the homes are different styles, shapes, and sizes. But they all have one thing in common. And that one thing they have in common is the metal roofs. Well, there's two reasons for the metal roofs here in Old Town Key West. First of all, up until 1940, we had no running water here. So any water used for drinking or bathing was rainwater caught on these metal roofs. And through a series of gutters, it would be stored in the cisterns in the backyard. Well, in 1940, the U.S. Navy built the first pipeline coming down from the Everglades. We still use that pipeline today for our drinking water in Key West. Now, the other reason for the metal roofs is that in 1886, there was a large fire here. It started up on Duval Street, burned for about 12 and a half hours. Now, that fire was burning. The folks who live in this neighborhood would jump in a boat, go out in the bay, and watch the fire burn. What they would notice is, as embers were flying around, if they landed on a shingle roof or a wooden roof, that home would be destroyed. But if they landed on a metal roof, many times, that ember would quickly go out. So after that fire of 1886, Key West mandated that every home in Key West would have a metal roof. Now folks, we're going to go through a small quiet zone, so I'll get back to you as soon as I get around to the next corner. But feel free to talk among yourselves.
You want gum? Why?
Folks, earlier I told you that Key West is twice the size today as it was back in the 1800s. This area over to the right is Old Town. This to the left is New Town. Now, New Town was formed back in the late 1800s when the Navy started dredging so larger ships could come into the harbor. What they would dredge up is a mixture of sand, coal, and seashells. They called that mixture marl. Now, this marl they would dump over in the shallow side. And after about a week in the sun, that marl would turn hard as a rock. So the city fathers decided to extend the city. Now, over here in New Town, we've got wider streets. We've got our shopping centers. Got our car dealerships. We even got our own airport, plus high schools and grade schools. Whereas over here to the right in Old Town, it's basically the same way it was back in the 1800s, with narrow streets and the houses built very close together. Now, just ahead of us on the left are mangrove trees. These mangrove trees are responsible for starting many of the 1,200 different islands that make up the Florida Keys. A little mangrove tree has got a very gnarly root system. It goes down into the salt water. Now that gnarly root system will collect any debris or dust and dirt that happens to pass by it. And the island just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and then the mangrove trees keep growing on around it. Until finally it's big enough they finally name it one of the Florida Keys. Now coming up on the corner, we're going to pass a statue for Jose Marti. Jose Marti was a freedom fighter for the Cuban community. He was actually a poet and a journalist, but he would come here and give many inspirational speeches to the Cuban folks back when they were trying to get their independence from Spain. So the Cuban community built that little monument for Jose Marti. And later today we'll pass his home where he would actually give some of these speeches. I'll point it out to you. Now folks, here to the right, this is Bayview Park, because it was right down here on the bay. Well, this park used to belong to one man named Eduardo Gatto. Well, he was very successful. He was a Cuban and had cigar factories. And in 1921, he was getting ready to go back to Havana and retire. He got a large home this out over where the blue playground equipment is. Well, the city were going to buy this property from him, but they had no use for the home. So they told Eduardo he could do whatever he wanted with that home. Because if he didn't do something, they were going to have to tear it down. Well, he didn't want to see the house torn down, so he jacked it up and he put it on some rollers. And with the aid of 2 young mules, he moved that home 2 city blocks. Now we're past that home coming up on the right. He named it after his wife Mercedes and donated it to the Cuban community as a charity hospital. And this building coming up on our right remained the Mercedes Charity Hospital until the early 1970s. And at that time, it was bought by some real estate investors. And of course, they made it into condominiums and apartments. Folks, we're coming up to White Street. On White Street, we're going to turn left. You'll be right on the edge of the Cuban community here in Key West. Now, if you were to walk down White Street early in the morning, you can smell coffee being brewed. Cuban coffee being brewed here is much stronger and much more robust than American coffee. And they serve it 2 different ways. One way they serve it's in a small plastic cup or styrofoam cup about the size of a shot glass. This they call buchi. Well, they also serve it with milk and sugar. And this they call con leche. Now, you can also smell fresh bread being baked. Because they bake fresh bread every day for their Cuban sandwiches. And it looks a lot like French bread, but it's made without any preservatives, and it's much softer and much sweeter. But after about 3 or 4 days, that bread will turn hard as a rock. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Also, if you're down here early in the morning or late in the evening, you can hear the Cuban music being played. Folks, here on the island of Key West, you probably heard the word conch, like a conch on the head. Well, a conch is an edible sea creature. It grows in this conch shell. From the meat of that conch, they make conch fritters, conch salads, conch steaks, even conch chowder. If you get a chance to try some while you're here in Key West, do so, because it is very delicious. Now, the very first people on the island of Key West to be called conchs were Bahamians that would come over here and settle. Later on, anybody that was born here was called a conch. Well, if you stay here for 7 years, they'll give you the distinction of being a freshwater conch. And if you played football in the high school football team, you've been a fighting conch. Whereas the little young cheerleaders and the boosters, they're called the conchettes. But also here in Key West, you're what's called the Conch Republic. Now, this Conch Republic was founded back in 1982. At that time, the U.S. government had set up a roadblock up on Highway 1. Highway 1's the only access to the island and only egress back to the mainland. They were looking for contraband, illegal aliens. Well, what they were doing is stopping traffic. Sometimes they would back up for 8 to 10 hours. Well, that upset the tourists, so they quit coming. That, in fact, upset the city fathers. So the city fathers and the mayor went to the government to see if they'd remove the block. They said, no, not at this time. So they said, okay, you're treating us like a foreign country. We're going to act like one. We're going to secede from the Union. So on April 23rd, they gathered up all the old stale Cuban bread they could find, walked down to the Navy Yard, started throwing it across the fence at the Navy officers that were sitting out in the yard. Now, before those officers could react, they surrendered. And they said, we're still being treated like a foreign country, so we're going to file for foreign aid. So they filed for $8 million of foreign aid. We never did see any of the foreign aid money, but that roadblock was quickly removed because the news media got down here and they made such a fiasco about that roadblock that it was a great embarrassment to the government. Now, folks, off to the left, we're going to pass the White Street Pier. This is called by many of the local folks the unfinished highway to Havana. Just ahead on the left, there will be a monument to some African slaves. Now, these African slaves were on a slave ship that were headed for Cuba when they were caught up in this large hurricane. They were washed ashore. Now, the bodies have been taken and removed back down to Kenya, but the monument still remains. And this to the left is one of the 3 Civil War forts on the island, the West Martello Tower. It's been turned over to the Ladies Club, and they have a beautiful garden center in there today. Now, this area we're driving through right now is the Heath Beach area. Notice as we're looking out at the beautiful ocean setting through those picnic tables, playground equipment, you don't see any wave action out here on this ocean front like you would see anywhere else in the country. That's because out at sea at 5 miles out is the largest living coral reef in the northern hemisphere. That coral reef goes from Miami all the way down to the dry Tortugas. Breaks up any wave action coming ashore. So without any wave action, all this sand you see on the beaches, that's not local. That's either been shipped in from further up the East Coast where they do have wave action, or it's brought in by ship from the Bahamas. And they replenish that sand about every 3 years. Folks, here in Key West, you'll hear the name of Henry Flagler. He was very instrumental to the history of Key West. But back in 1906, he was 78 years old.
Now looking out here on your right.
He was a very rich man because he was one of the founders of Standard Oil Company up in Ohio. He decided he wanted to build a train to come down from Miami here in Key West. He was going to call it the Overseas Railroad. In order to do so, he had to find some concrete that could be mixed with salt water. He found that over in Germany, so he put up $50 million of his own money. He got that concrete and built those 42 bridges to bring the railroad here. Well, it actually arrived in 1912. Well, at that time he built this large hotel. Over to the left, the Casa Marina. And the Casa Marina was made out of that same German concrete. The Casa Marina means house by the sea. Now, all the guests from his train, they would come and stay in that hotel. And as you notice as we're going past it, on the roof of that hotel, some beautiful barrel tiles. Those are handmade barrel tiles that come from Havana. Now they're tied into a gutter system that goes all around the building. Then that gutter system comes down the side of the building and dumps into the basement. But down in the basement, there's a 760,000 gallon cistern. that holds all the rainwater that's caught on the roof. Now, if you came into one of the trains and was a guest in this hotel, it wouldn't matter if you were one of the Astors or the Vanderbilts or the President of the United States. Everybody that stayed here would drink the same rainwater and bathe in the same rainwater. Now, the room back then would run between $8 and $12 a night. That included all your meals. They still use that cistern in the basement to water all these plants on the ground across the marina. Now, here at the corner, I'm going to turn right. If I'm turning right, look off to the left out at the Atlantic Ocean. You'll see aids to navigation, like buoy systems, a rangefinder. And as I'm turning, if you look way out, you can see an unmanned lighthouse out on the coral reef. Go back before we had those aids to navigation, you would hear this cry around town. Folks, back then when you would hear this cry wreck ashore, every able-bodied seaman here on the island would jump in a boat and rush out to the coral reef. Because back then we were having between 1 and 4 shipwrecks every week. Now these ships were coming back from South America, loaded with gold, silver, and emeralds. They were going back to the mother country. Well, they had no idea that that reef was out there because it was unmarked. So the very first captain to make it out there, he would be called the record captain. Now his responsibility, first of all, was to get all survivors back ashore. Once he got the survivors back, then he would go back out there with those other captains, and they would dive for all that cargo. Once they got that cargo, they'd bring it ashore, and it would go through a federal court system. After it went through the court system, it would be sold at an auction. Well, the proceeds from that auction sale, the largest percentage would go to the record captain, that first one that made it out there. And the rest of it would be shared with all the other captains that did the diving for the cargo. Well, that made Key West at that time the richest city per capita in the United States. Now, the very first inhabitants of the island of Key West were Native Americans. These Native Americans would come here and stay on the island waiting for the Florida Straits to get nice and calm so they could go across and trade with the Cuban folks. Well, anytime they'd have conflicts with other Native Americans that were here, and if they had anybody die, they had no way of burying them because they couldn't dig in this hard coral to bury the dead. So they would just lay the bodies out on the coral and let nature take its course. So back in the 1500s when the Spanish people first got here, they saw there were little white bones all over the island. Once they realized what had happened, they called the island Kiowaso, which meant Little Island of Bones. But a few years later, some English people showed up. They mispronounced the name Kiowaso. They thought it meant Key West, thinking it was the most western island on the Florida Keys. Well, a few years later, in 1513, another Spanish gentleman came along. His name was Ponce de Leon. Now, Ponce was looking for the Fountain of Youth. Well, he found that Fountain of Youth up at St. Augustine. But he also found another island further west on the Florida Keys chain. Now, this island he named the Dry Tortugas. Dry because there was no drinking water, and Tortugas because the island was covered with sea turtles. Now, folks, here in the 17th and 1800s, one of the largest industries around was pirating. Well, the Bahama Republic, they finally got rid of the pirating down in the Caribbean, but there was still some up here on the Florida Keys. So at that time, the U.S. government sent down a Commodore by the name of David Porter. Now, he had a fleet of small ships called the Mosquito Fleet. That little Mosquito Fleet could zip around the islands and apprehend those larger pirate ships because they had a low draft, and they would swarm down on those ships just like a fleet of, like a swarm of mosquitoes. And they finally put the pirating to bed here in Key West in 1828. So in 1829, Key West filed for incorporation. Now, folks, we're coming into the southernmost point in the city of Key West. And as you can see over here to the left is the southernmost hotel. But coming up on the right is another southernmost hotel. This is the one on the beach. The one on the right is just the southernmost hotel. And in the parking lot of the southernmost hotel used to sit the home of Eduardo Gatto Jr. Now, Jr., He didn't like the way the sun was shining in the afternoon in his eyes when he was reading his newspaper. So he took a page out of his daddy's book. He jacked his house up that was in the parking lot, put it on some rollers, turned it 180 degrees, and moved it across the street. The only thing he didn't do was change the house number. So the house across the street has got an odd number on the even side of the street in Key West. The only one like it. Now coming up on our left, this large Queen Anne Victorian style home on the corner is the original southernmost house in the continental United States. Now, this was the home of Judge Vining Harris. And he would build this home for his wife. She loved to entertain, but she did not like house guests. So that home was built with just one bedroom.
Oh, okay.
Now, the initial wiring done in this home was done by Thomas Edison himself. But then there was another lady that came here back in the 1940s. She was an author. Her name was Thelma Stradle. Well, she was writing a book about the wrecking industry called Reap the Wild Winds. It was later made into a movie, and it starred John Wayne and Ray McCall. But she built her house over here 18 inches further south. So today it's called the southernmost house in the continental United States. Now here to the left, folks, is the icon that is the southernmost point in the continental United States. Now this icon is 90 miles from Cuba, and it's 157 miles from Miami. But it's also 67 miles further south than Brownsville, Texas. But the interesting thing is that icon is closer to Cuba than it is to the closest Walmart that is 121 miles from here. Now over to the left behind this fence is Truman Annex, the communications center for the Caribbean. It's run by the U.S. Navy. It's also a housing area for a U.S. Naval Air Station that's located up at Boca Chica Island. It's one of the largest Top Gun units in the nation. And when those young pilots come here to train, this is where they're housed over here in Truman Annex. Now, folks, as we're driving through Old Town Key West, notice the green, beautiful palm trees. And the trees are all nice and green. And look at the bougainvilleas, they're all out in bloom. Well, they stay like that year-round here, because we're in a tropical area. We're right on the northern rim of the Caribbean. The hottest temperature here in Key West is 97 degrees, whereas the coolest temperature, 41. Both those temperature extremes came the same year, back in 1887. Now off here to the right, the second building over, with the green roof, the green shutters, it's got an atrium on the back. That's one of the latest tourist attractions built here on the island, the Butterfly Conservatory. Now this Butterfly Conservatory is one of the latest tourist attractions built here on the island. And it's got over 60 different varieties of butterflies flying around inside. And if you were to tour this inside, and one of those butterflies would land on you, it's considered very good luck. Now, folks, here in Key West, Old Town, the first cigar factory was built in 1831 by a Cuban man by the name of William Wall. Well, by the late 1800s, they had 160 of those factories here, because Key West was a natural humidor. Plus, those Cuban folks were trying to get away from the oppression of the Spanish. So by the early 1900s, they were hand-rolling over 100 million cigars a year in this natural humidor of Key West. Now here to the right, behind these umbrellas, is the home of Jose Marti. This is where Jose Marti would give many of his inspirational speeches to his Cuban friends.
Political being, as I understand, the Cuban of the Key West is.
Here to the left, these two white buildings, they were built here as the Cuban Club. The Cuban Club was a cultural center, educational center, and medical center, where the Cuban folks that were working in the cigar factory. Down the street to the left, we're getting ready to turn down Virginia Street, was an area known as Gato Village. It was a village built by Eduardo Gato. It was actually a city within the city. It's where all the Cuban cigar rollers that were working in his factories. Now in this city within the city, they had their own grocery stores. They had their own schools, churches. They also had their own housing. You know, it was much more inexpensive to live here than it was anywhere else out on the island of Key West. So that kept those cigar rollers very happy.
Plenty of room.
Now, folks, coming up at the corner, I'm going to turn right. And the street we'll be turning on is Whitehead Street. Whitehead Street's named after John Whitehead. He was an actual survivor of a shipwreck out on the coral reef.
I don't have gum.
When his shipwreck, they brought him ashore. He fell in love with Key West. He also fell in love with the tropical weather. So he hung around. He ended up being one of the first owners of the island of Key West. At this time, though, as we're making the turn, if you look off to the left, up above the tree lines ahead of us, you'll see the Key West Lighthouse. Now, this Key West Lighthouse used to be down by the southernmost point. But in 1846, there was a large hurricane here. That lighthouse was washed out to sea. Well, the following year, they rebuilt it up here on higher ground. When they did, well, it stayed in operation for about 20 years. Until they built that unmanned lighthouse that we saw when we were coming around that corner back there. Then it was turned over to the city as a tourist attraction. And today you can go up 88 steps and come out of that ring at the top. You'll be 92 feet above sea level. You can look out and see the coral reef 5 miles out at sea. But then there's some other plaques up there on that ring that tell you different things you'll be looking for around the island of Key West. So it's a great place to go take pictures. Coming up on our right, we're going to pass a large brick fence. You know, that big brick fence is what's called the house of Ernest Hemingway and his wife Pauline. And they were given this house as a wedding present by Pauline's Uncle Gus. And they actually lived here for about 9 years. And while they lived here, Ernest would write many of his novels. Those novels would include The Snows of Kilimanjaro, To Have or Have Not, and of course, For Whom the Bell Tolled. But once he passed away, Pauline sold that property to her relatives. Now they turned it into the Hemingway House Museum. And today you can see the very first swimming pool that was built here on the island. Coming up on the left, the white church is a Zion AME church, built by Sandy Cornish. Sandy Cornish has been a slave up in Maryland. Found his way to freedom, he came down here to Key West. He was gifted, he had a very green thumb. He could grow plants and vegetation on this corner that no one else could grow. So he became a very rich man and built that church as a gift to the Key West people. He only had one stipulation. That is that the doors of that church would never close. So they remain open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Coming up on our left, we're going to pass an area that's known as Key West Jackson Square. It's named after Andrew Jackson, who was the first military governor of the state of Florida and the 7th president of the United States. And in the center of the property sits the Monroe County Courthouse. That is the county seat for all the Florida Keys, because they all belong to Monroe County. Coming up on our right, we're going to pass a small sign. This is mile marker 0, coming down from Fort Kent, Maine, up on the Canadian border. Now this little sign is one of the most stolen signs here on the island of Key West, especially during spring break. Because as we pass it, you'll notice it just takes a small wrench and 4 nuts and bolts, and you walk off with that little sign. Now, folks, here in Key West back in the 1960s, there was a group formed called the Restoration Group of Old Town. Their job was to go around and convince people to restore their homes rather than tear them down, to make room for parking lots and service stations.
You want to go back to the ship?
Well,
Yeah, okay.
their job was to convince those people not to tear them down.
Yeah, we're going back.
So they would give away a nice plaque and a monetary value every year for the best restored house on the island. Coming up on our right, we're going to pass a little 2-story house. Just above the 407 number on that house, there'll be a little plaque. That's the plaque that's given out every year for the best restored house on the island. Just above the 407 number, you'll see the little round plaque with the star in the center. Now here we're going to turn right. As we're turning right, if you look up at the ceilings of the porches and the overhangs of the roofs of these three houses, you'll notice they're all painted blue. Well, there's two reasons for this blue paint. The first reason is that the birds and the bees and bugs, they won't build nests up there because they think it's the blue sky. But then also, Key West natives were very, very superstitious. They thought that blue hue would keep away any evil spirits from their homes. You'll see that all over the island of Key West as we're traveling around today with our tour. Coming up at the next corner is a large church. This is St. Paul's Episcopal Church. It's the oldest non-Roman Catholic church in all of southern Florida. Now, it's been destroyed 3 times, twice by hurricane and once by fire. But this time it's been rebuilt out of concrete, hoping that it won't meet this demise again.
148.
All right, thanks, sir. Now, folks, if you go inside this church and tour it, you'll notice it looks just like the inside of a sailing ship. That's because St. Paul was the patron saint of the sailor.
And the lady said it's gonna let us hop on or off. It's not. She lied.
Now coming up on the next corner, we're going to pass another large church. This church coming up is called the United Methodist Church. It's called the Old Stone Church, but it started out as a wooden church, so it's the longest standing church in all of southern Florida. Well, while it was a little wooden church, they were afraid of the fires and hurricanes, so they mined all this stone on the property site and built the stone church around that little wooden church. Once the stone church was completed, they took apart the wooden church and carried it out through the front doors. They say they never missed a Sunday service. Now the walls in this church are some of them 2 foot thick. It protects them from the hurricanes. And this little hill we're climbing right now is Solaris Hill, the highest hill in Key West. As we head across streets, we'll be 16 feet above sea level. Now as we come back down the other side, there'll be a little white picket fence off to the right. And beyond that little white picket fence, there's an octagon house with green shutters. And this was the home of clothing designer Calvin Klein when he lived here on the island. And coming up on the next corner is the Bahama House. The Bahama House is peach colored with green shutters. Now, it's also called the first mobile home on the island of Key West. Back in 1847, the year after the a ship captain from the Bahamas came here to build a home for his wife and family. Well, he got here and there was no building materials. Everything had been washed away by the hurricane. So he went back to the Bahamas, took apart his home there, put it on a ship, brought it back and rebuilt it. Thus it became the first mobile home on the island of Key West. Now, folks, here in Key West, there are many tropical classical designs that you won't find anywhere else in the country. And one of those classical designs is coming up here on the right. The second house in with the 410 number. This house is called an eyebrow house. The windows on the second floor are the eyes, and the brow is that roof line that overhangs. Now the idea is that no sunlight ever gets into the upstairs of that home, yet the air can circulate around underneath that roof line and cool the upstairs of the home. Here in Key West, there are over 100 different designs of that eyebrow house, and we'll be passing more of them later on in our tour. Now, earlier I told you Key West was the richest city per capita in the 1800s. Well, in the 1930s, when the Great Depression hit, we were the poorest city. We were so poor that 90% of the people were on welfare. The city was broke. Well, they were going to turn in their city charter. Well, the government didn't want the city charter back because they were afraid other cities might try to do the same thing. They wanted this to be a tax-producing part of the country for the government. So they sent down a government man by the name of Julius Stone to find out what could be done with the city of Key West to make it profitable again to the government. Well, after looking around for about 8 weeks, he decided to go back and tell them that he thought it should be a tourist mecca. Once they agreed to it, they sent down the WPA. The WPA would help people paint their homes, paint their fences. They rebuilt streets and sidewalks. They even trimmed all the trees. They were getting ready for a grand reopening of Key West as a tourist mecca in the winter of 1935, when the snowbirds would start coming down for a vacation. Well, that same year on Labor Day, the largest hurricane to hit the northern hemisphere hit about 60 miles from here up in the Isla Barada. It wiped out about 45 miles of Flagler's Railroad. Back then, the railroad was the only way tourists could get down here to Key West. Now, the government went to the Flaglers to see if they were going to rebuild it. But they said no, that was their daddy's dream. They had no intention. But they did tell the government that they would sell them those bridges and piers that made up the bridges for the railroad. So the government bought them at a very good price, and that's where they built the very first Highway US 1, over those same piers and bridges that brought the railroad down here previously. And that brought back many tourists. Now here to the left, up on the top of this home, you'll notice a little structure. That little structure is called Captain's Walk. Now, Captain's Walk is where the captain would go stand and watch out for the next shipwreck. As soon as he saw it, he would rush out there in his boat. He wanted to be the first man out there to make that big money. Well, when he went out there, then his wife would go stand up there and watch out for him. She could tell which boat was his by the different colored sails. But many times those captains didn't make it back because there was storms. Also, they had to dive for all that cargo. And a lot of times they'd have to hold their breath for 8 to 10 minutes. And they didn't have any diving equipment back then. If they didn't make it back in, then that little structure was called a widow's walk. Folks, here on the street called Simonton Street, named after John Simonton. He was the first American owner of the island of Key West. He bought it from a Spanish general named Juan Pablo Salas. And he bought it for $2,000. Well, when he bought it, he had some very good friends up in Washington, D.C. He was able to convince them that Key West should be a port of entry into the United States. Once they agreed to it, he donated the land for the first Navy base here. Then he also split the island up into 4 sections. He kept one section for himself, and then he sold the other 3 sections to 3 of his friends, one being John Fleming, one being John Whitehead, and the other being Pardon Green. Now, these 4 gentlemen were the first owners of the island of Key West, and all 4 of them have streets named after them here in downtown Key West. Now, back in 1928, Ernest Hemingway and his wife Pauline were coming back from Havana. They'd been over there for about 4 years. Well, they'd ordered a little Ford Roadster here in Key West because they were going to experience driving up that brand new Highway 1 that went over top of all those piers and bridges. Well, once they got here to town, Ford dealership said that little car had been put on back order for about 8 weeks. So the Ford dealership put them up in the Casa Antigua, which is a little hotel right next door to the Ford dealership. And coming up on our left, there'll be a little glass and mirror building, a little blue building. That's where the Ford dealership used to be located. And the hotel they put them up in is the Casa Antigua right next door. Now, they would stay up here in this corner room for 8 weeks waiting on that little car. Once the car was done, they made their trip. But while he was there, he wrote the first rough draft of Farewell to Arms. Now, here to the right is another eyebrow house. This is one of the very few 3-story eyebrow houses on the island. Coming up on the right, we're going to pass a large brick building. This large brick building was the Curry Tobacco Warehouse. Back down during the 1886 fire, it was loaded with Cuban tobacco. Now, it had no windows, but it had doors and had metal plates over the doors. So the Curry family would rush up here, close those doors, close those metal plates, Then they would rush down to the bay and get into the boat and watch this fire burn. Once the fire went out, they would rush back up here, open those doors. Not a bit of that tobacco had been harmed. So at that time, they would come in some millionaires because they had the only raw materials for all those 160 factories to want to roll cigars. And coming up ahead of us on the next corner, the yellow building with the green trim, the metal roof, that's Coca-Cola bottling plant, one of the first ones built here in the United States. It was built here in 1906, long before we had running water. So down in the basement, there sits a 68,000-gallon cistern, which would collect the rainwater from the roof. And that rainwater is what Coca-Cola would use to make its Coca-Cola products. It remained here until 1970s, then they sold it, and now it's a little rum mill and a winery and some little gift shops. Now speaking of gift shops, we're going to be coming up to our first stop that's right up here on the right. It has a little gift shop and a snack bar, and inside the building there's restrooms. The ladies is off to the right of the snack bar, and men's is off to the left. And remember folks, we got 30 minutes left in our tour, and you can bring anything back on the train to eat or drink, as long as it's non-alcoholic. So just listen for me to make an announcement on the PA when we got about 2 minutes left to go. And then we'll get back on the train and go on up Duval Street to our Truval stop, which is right around the corner from the Hemingway House, the Lighthouse, the southernmost point, and the Butterfly Conservatory. Now, folks, remember this is Ed on train number 97, and I'll make that announcement on the PA. Anybody missing anybody out of the party? Alrighty, we're going to head on up to the rest of our tour. Train moving. Train is moving. Folks, when we pull out here, up to the right you'll see the glass bottom boat. That's the spirit of Key West. That boat goes out about 4 times a day for a 2-hour tour of this coral reef. It's a great way to see the coral reef without getting your feet wet. Now off to our right as we turn out, you'll see a red and yellow building. This was built here back in 1891 as a bank building by the Cuban cigar rollers. They built that bank because those employees were making so much money and they did not trust American bankers.
Okay.
So they built the bank building. And off on the side you'll see a porch. That's a hand-carved porch. It's been carved out of mahogany by one man. It took him 5 years to carve it. And it took 20 mules just to pull that up into place. Now this street we're driving on right now is Duval Street, named after William Polk Duval, who was the first civilian governor of the state of Florida and the longest reigning governor in Florida's history. And he would govern the state from his yacht, which he would anchor right outside Key West. Now over here to the right, believe it or not, they say this is the longest street in the nation. They say that because it goes from the Gulf of Mexico behind us to the Atlantic Ocean in front of us. But it's actually only about 15 blocks long, and if you're to walk it, it takes about 25 minutes to walk it in either direction. Now we're coming up to Green Street, which is named after Port Home Green, one of the first owners of the island. And off to the left on Green and Duval is Sloppy Joe's Bar. Now, Sloppy Joe Russell was a very good friend of Ernest Hemingway's. Many days they'd go fishing in Ernest's boat. Then they'd come back in the afternoon and stop into Sloppy Joe's and have a few cool ones, just to talk about their day of fishing. And then the back right-hand corner of the bar, there's much memorabilia of Ernest Hemingway's that you can go through anytime the bar is open. Now, folks, Duval Street keeps getting busier and busier as the day goes on. It stays that way up until about 4 o'clock tomorrow morning. That's when everything closes down. And then the street sweepers come out. They'll get it all ready and cleaned up for tomorrow. Because it'll be just as active and busy tomorrow as it is today. Coming up on our left behind these large umbrellas is the John Fogarty House. John Fogarty was the mayor here in town in 1912. when the Flagler Railroad would come. He at that time would invite everybody from the railroad to come down to his house and have a little party out on the lawn. That little lawn party ended up lasting for 3 days. The Duval Street was a party street then, just like it is today. Now coming up on the right, we're going to pass the oldest house in Key West. It's off to the right. It's got the raised porch. It's got 3 different sized dormers on the top of the roof. This was built here in 1829. Now it was built by a shipwreck captain named Captain Washington. We raised $6 here at this house. Those $6 he'd make walk to school. But they didn't have to walk very far because the schoolhouse is 2 doors down on the right. This is the oldest schoolhouse in the U.S. of all the schoolhouses. As we cross over Eaton Street, off to the right you'll see a large yellow building. This is the La Concha Hotel. It's our skyscraper here in Key West. 7 stories tall. This is where, back in 1947, playwright Tennessee Williams would come here to rent a room. He came here because he wanted to rewrite his play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Because when it first went out, it had a lot of negative reviews up in New York. So he came down here, rented a room, and rewrote the play. When it went out the second time, it was a #1 hit. He decided to come back here to Key West, bought him a home, and lived here for the rest of his life, some 34 years later. He loved Duval Street, he loved activity on Duval Street, and he loved this tropical weather. Coming up ahead of us on the right, just beyond where the Penske truck is Jimmy Buffett's original Margaritaville, where you can still get a cheeseburger here in the Paradise Island of the U.S. Just beyond that, the large yellow building, this is the San Carlos Institute. Now this is where the fire of 1886 actually got started. That building actually looks just like the City Hall building over in Havana today. Coming up on our left, we would pass the Strand Theater, which is home to our Walgreens pharmacy today. But this has got a decor called the Rococo decor. Now that Rococo decor can be found in many of the streetfront buildings in Havana. And this next block of Duval Street, the 600 block, back when the Navy was here in force, was geared strictly for the Navy men. This was little brothels, tattoo parlors, bars, anything a young Navy man would want. Well, the gates of the Navy Yard were right down here to the right on Southern Street. Well, when the Navy pulled out in 1974, this block was devastated. All these buildings were boarded up. People went bankrupt. No more sailors, no more business. So it was a real blight to Duval Street. At that time, the city fathers had to come up with some kind of a ploy to get rid of this blight. Well, folks, the city decided to sell these little stores for $1 a piece to local people. All they had to do was fix them up, have them painted, and up and running as a new business for 1976, which was the bicentennial year. Many of the folks who bought them back then for $1, they still own them today. So it was a pretty good investment. A little bit of elbow grease and a good coat of paint. Coming up, we're going to be coming into the Bahama Village area. And the Bahama Village is where every year they have a Goombay Festival. Goombay Festival is Bahamian festival, and they shut down this Petronia Street. And they shut it down. They'll build little kiosks here for food and drink. And also they will sell many of the artwork and handicrafts that come from the Bahamas. And if you come down this street, when they're having that Goombay Festival, you can hear steel drum music being played, just like if you were in the Bahamas. folks, we're going to turn left here on Whitehead Street. But on down the street on Victoria, you see where the traffic light is? That's where the Blue Heaven Cafe is located. The Blue Heaven Cafe used to be called the Blue Goose Arena. Now at the Blue Goose Arena, from time to time, they'd have boxing matches. When they would have these boxing matches, Ernest Hemingway would come and referee. And at the end of the day, he'd put the box gloves on and go one round with the winning boxer. Then they'd all head back over to Sloppy Joe's, have a few cool ones, and talk about their day of boxing. Now, we're coming back up to the Hemingway house on the left. As we pass it, notice the fences around there. Those bricks used to be the cobblestones in the street that we're driving on right now. But back when the city was redoing plumbing, they sold those to Ernest Hemingway for a penny apiece. And he and his buddies from Sloppy Joe's, after they'd had a few, would come and build that fence. But looking at that fence, it looks like they had more than just a few. Now, the fence was there because he was getting more and more popular, and people would just come any hour of the night and day looking at his windows and doors. So they built that privacy fence. Coming up on our right, we're going to pass the lighthouse keeper's house. Now, if you go past it, notice there's two front doors. That's because it took two families to operate the lighthouse. Now, they each had their own living quarters, but they did share the same kitchen. Well, one family would go up for 4 hours, and they would clean the mirrors of prisons that reflect the light out onto the coral reef. And then the next family would go up for the next 4 hours. And that went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now we're going to be coming around the corner and we'll be stopping at our very next stop, which is at our True-Ball stop. And if you want to come tour the Hemingway house, you just come 1 block down on Truman. You'll be right here at Hemingway house and the lighthouse. And if you want to go down to the southernmost point with the Butterfly Conservatory, you just walk on down Duval about 3 blocks to South Street, and you'll be at the southernmost point and the Butterfly Conservatory. And then you can come back and catch a train here at the station. Right where I drop you off, there'll be another train coming through about every 15 to 20 minutes. And it'll continue the tour because we all do the same tour from this point on.
Here, go through the southernmost part. Yeah, it's back there. Yeah.
Alrighty folks, this should be like a real quick stop. If anybody needs directions, just come and ask me and I'll be glad to help you out.